I think an unleashed leader is one who is self-aware, who's emotionally intelligent, and who's a servant leader. I think when you do those things, you're going to be creating environments where people want to stay because they're going to feel seen, heard, valued, respected, and understood. That's where people do their best work.
Welcome to the Unleashing Leaders podcast, where we work with willing leaders to accelerate the changes you seek. We'll learn from the experiences of different leaders facing real challenges and distill practical, purposeful steps to apply in your context. I'm Lee Scott, your curious co-pilot. Together, let's make positive changes for our companies and communities. Welcome back to the Unleashing Leaders podcast. Today, we are joined by Andrew Adeniyi, and he is the founder and principal for AAA Solutions based out of Indianapolis, Indiana. He is going to be sharing today with us two really key points that don't always get the attention that they deserve, but are so key to peak performance. And one of them is, yes, we talk about company values and the shared values and how do we align with those. We're going to be looking at it from the inside out today to be able to find out what are the unique or complementary values that every person brings to the table, and how do we encourage that authentic contribution and showing up by tapping into those. The other thing we're going to be looking at is how do we create then a team environment that encourages that psychological safety. We've all read the studies. We know about what a key aspect that is to allowing people to perform at their best. But let's look at some practical techniques for how do we as a leader be able to help foster that in our organizations. Andrew, it is great to have you on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, you've been quite busy, man. Like you said, the last few weeks, you're on the circuit, speaking, sharing your lessons learned that you learned as a practitioner. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing now. What is your organization all about? Who are you, man?
Yeah. So my name's Andrew Adeniyi, as you mentioned, the CEO and founder of AAA Solutions, and really specialize in two things. So it's workplace culture and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So at AAA Solutions, we do a lot of audits and assessments. We help leaders create 3-year strategic plans to advance and elevate their culture. And then we help them implement those plans as well, typically with cross-functional groups that are representative of the organization as a whole. Also provide a lot of training and facilitation around the two books that I've written, The Circle of Leadership and The Building Blocks of Belonging. So typically out consulting and speaking with folks is usually consuming most of my professional time. So that's a little bit about what I'm doing currently.
Right on. Yeah, 2 books under your belt there. We'll talk a little bit more about those, I'm sure, in a minute. But I like this notion of, how do you cultivate a culture of belonging, right? Like it's beyond, just hitting the numbers or the ratios. It's beyond even just, showing respect. It's really creating a place where people can do their best work. So really appreciate that. But that's not what you started. I mean, you've been doing this since, I think, February of 2020.
Yep. That's when I started the business. Yep.
Great time to go out on your own. I'm a firm believer the best entrepreneurs are the ones who start in the headwinds of adversity. That definitely separates the wheat from the chaff. But prior to doing this, you came about discovering what this looked like on your own personal journey. So what's a little bit about your backstory?
Yeah, so I had the pleasure of working for an international retailer right out of undergrad. So I went to Indiana University for undergrad, studied entrepreneurship, and had a couple internships with the international grocer, ended up working for them full time. And the division I worked for was one of the best in the country at the time, top 3 out of 24 divisions. The CEO came from that division. Many executives came there, just had an excellent culture all around. And since that was my introduction to the workforce, I just assumed.
Oh God, that like ruined you, man.
Listen, it was sweet for me, right? I mean, pay was good, benefits were good. I was getting stretch assignments and mentorship, and I really was growing at a rapid rate. And I just assumed that that's what was happening for a lot of people.
That was the norm, right? Yeah,
I thought that was the norm. Yeah,
you roll out of college and you just have this amazing, fulfilling career that's got all the right things firing on all the cylinders, right?
Absolutely. And it was a blessing, and then I had a promotion opportunity to work for one of the worst divisions in the country. And that was on the East Coast. So I went there for a couple of years. And when I got there, my mind was just blown with how terrible the environment was. And I remember asking myself, how can the training be the same, pay be the same access to top business students and top leaders, and the culture be so different? And that set me on the journey to figure out, how would you turn around a culture like that if you inherited it, right? A culture of fear, a culture where people don't have your back, where you're keeping tabs on all the things you've done in the workplace just to ensure that you can kind of defend yourself, and all the things you don't really want in a workplace. How would you manage that? That really started my journey. I happened to be in my master's program at the time with Michigan State, and I was an online master's program in management strategy and leadership. So it really just created the perfect environment where I was living a real life case study,
Case study.
if you
Yeah,
will.
this is your laboratory.
Yeah. So day in and day out, I was like, okay, so this is exactly how you're not supposed to do it. And I come from an environment where I was like, this is exactly how you're supposed to do it. And then I got the book knowledge to reinforce the terms and the concepts and the strategy behind all of that. And that's when this work was really birthed, was me writing that first book to take a stab at, what would you do if you inherited a poor culture? So that was kind of my foundation even before the business was officially started.
Wow. Wow. Well, I'm a firm believer that the best consultant educators were practitioners that were raised by in fire, right? So you definitely have that. And in the starkness of the contrast from being able to see what it could be. And what I like the distinction about your particular use case is you're right. Like it's almost like this great little laboratory environment where you're controlling certain variables. It's the same company, same top level leadership. And this is a great point I love to make to folks is they're like, well, it has to start at the top. It has to start at the top. Well, this is a perfect example where it may have started at the top, but it clearly died in some of those divisions before it got down there, right? So, you can have it at the top or you cannot have it at the top. That has no bearing on the microculture, right? On the actual team you're leading. And so here you are, you're like, so many of these variables are the same, and yet the realities are totally different. So what's going into this, right? You can really distinguish what's happening there. So what were some of the patterns that you saw? How was it that the culture was so radically different?
So when I was in Indiana, that division had a culture of, we compete against ourselves. Like excellence is our average. Like this is how we show up. We go above and beyond. We exceed expectations. That was just instilled in you from the beginning, right? From onboarding. This is like, no, we're not like everyone else, right? This is a privilege to be here. This is special. So that energy and environment really permeated through everything that we did in the Indiana division.
Now, Andrew, just to clarify though, but was that like a brochure they gave you? Was it like on a PowerPoint? Like how did they communicate this practically? Like what was the thing that embedded it, because it's maybe not just what they said, but how they said it. So tell us a little bit about that.
So there's always intentionality around the backstory of the organization and the history of the organization, the division as well, not just the larger organization, but the division and how prominent of a role that division has played historically in the overall success of the organization. So, all new hires would go through that process, and we would be brought back to help facilitate some of that content for newer people. So it's not like it was a one and done situation. They were very intentional with ensuring some of the more recent folks who went through the program and who were going up the ranks were also coming back and shedding light and sharing stories with some of the newer people. So early on, that's some of the first stuff that came to mind, even things like dress code, right? We were expected to wear suit and tie every single day, but you couldn't just wear any suit and tie. It was very particular around a more conservative, polished approach. There'd be comments on the types of shoes you would wear and things like that. And, although that may not be the best culture for some, and I would say today, that's probably not my preferred culture. Coming out of college, it definitely gave me the end of the spectrum to say, okay, I know what it means to be 22, be a district manager, have people who report to you who are twice your age, and all of the things you need to put together to earn respect and to position yourself well as a strong leader. And part of it's appearance. Part of it's being sharp and paying attention to detail. Even the type of pens we use, right? Ensuring that you have good quality pens, keeping your car clean. Like those little details that aren't like just in a training manual or something like that. There's a high level of attention to detail around that. So just a lot of small things, I would say.
Well, Andrew, speaking to that, and again, what those mechanisms are is will evolve with the times. I mean, I definitely remember coming out of college. That was my experience, right? It was like, I had 3 suits, man, and I that was all I could afford, and I rotated through, but they were darn good quality suits, and then having the mix and match, but it allowed you to physiologically control your state. And we talk oftentimes about one of the keys to success is making sure that you and your team are in the right psychological state, where I've mentioned that in a little bit here. And, there's levers to how you get in the right state, and dressing for success, right, is a physical trigger to be like, oh, I'm putting on my Superman suit. I'm putting on my Wonder Woman suit, right? And I'm now in a state where I'm a professional and I'm a leader, and I'm exuding excellence, down to the tools that I'm using. So it's just a mechanism for being able to trigger getting people in the right state. And whether that's the right way to do it for a particular organization, like there's many ways you can do it, but that's just using those, managing those physiological things that we all think are unrelated. They're absolutely essential for getting you in the right state. So anyways, please continue. You're about to make the bridge to the contrast there.
Yeah. So, really paying attention to the details, like we mentioned, was among the things that I think really separated the Indiana division. But on the East Coast, it was much different. That was a division where they were growing very rapidly, opening new stores very rapidly. There was not always the level of attention to detail as what you would expect. There wasn't as much of the human connection and really trying to push and challenge folks in a positive way. A lot of it was based off of fear, right? We're not performing well as a division, so we need to hit these numbers or else we got to get overtime in order. So what are you doing around hiring? And it wasn't like a collaborative, supportive environment. It was, hey, I need to get this done or else my job may be on the line. And what's interesting is the higher performing division that had way higher expectations was way more challenging. You didn't have that fear. It's just it was so fascinating to me. I'm like, here you are trying to crank this whip, but you guys suck. and my VP from the old division, she's got it right. And I'll give you an example. I mentioned that the division in Indiana was typically a top 3 division. And we had a series of maybe 3 or 4 months at one point where we were dropping and we were in the middle of the pack, like 16 to 18. And there's a lot of different factors that led to that. But typically our VP would not sit in our district manager meetings, but she sat in the meeting about I think the 3rd or 4th month after we were declining. And she just sat in the meeting and basically let people know that we're not performing the way that we should and that we got to live up to a higher standard. And she met with every single district manager that day and stayed until like 8 p.m. that night. Typically our meetings are done by like 4. And she met with each person and she basically just asked, what can she do to better support us to get to the results we need? And what can she hold us accountable to doing? No fear, no job on the line. And here we are, had the worst stretch probably in her 20-year career at that point. And still in that moment, there's no fear. Whereas on the East Coast, there's times where the VP would pop in and the energy he would bring to the room was strictly on, hey, we're missing the mark on productivity. Like, you guys need to be going to the stores earlier. You need to be doing this. You need to be doing that. It's just sucked the air out of the room just with the presence. And you can't sustain high performance when you have a culture of fear.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, I love the opening question that she asked, which was, what can I do to better support you? Right. That sends a message of, that servant leadership, right? That inverted pyramid. It sends a message that I'm just as accountable for this as anybody else. And I'm willing to go first and say, there's something that I'm probably not doing that I can do. And if it's okay for me to acknowledge that, it's okay for you. And then she followed up. There's like, and then what can I ask you guys to be accountable? And not what you should be accountable for, but what could I hold you accountable for? So now they're the ones offering to say, well, hey, we could do more of this. We could do less of that. And it sounds like, well, it's just semantic, right? It's the same, result. It's the same outcome, get to the store earlier, display your products on the shelves differently, whatever it is, right? And you're like, but the energy, one, like you said, has got that taint of fear, which constrains creativity. The other one has nothing but hope and invitation, which opens up the creativity. So again, the state is utterly different there. What a contrast. What a contrast. Well, that was a hugely formative experience for you, Andrew. But then your career took you elsewhere and you got to add to that learning. So tell us a little about the next step in that journey. And then let's loop back to how we can practically, when we inherit these kind of dysfunctional cultures, how do we lead out of it?
Yeah, so kind of took a step of faith and a leap of faith, which is really has now been kind of a theme in my professional journey. But ended up being with Kroger, which was a great experience, and worked with their Ruler Foods division, which was almost like a startup within Kroger, which was pretty cool. And they really were trying to model themselves after Aldi, which was the first employer I was speaking of, and learned a lot there. That was a tremendous experience just to be able to almost be in a massive organization, but feel like you're kind of leading a startup. So learned a great deal while I was working there. But I would say the big kind of change or pivot happened when I went to Starbucks, and that was my next role after I'd left Kroger. And at that point, I'd read case studies on Starbucks. They were infused in the master's program.
Yeah, they were the darlings in that era, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
they were doing everything right. Everybody wanted them.
Exactly. How do you create this culture of belonging? And getting there, my mind was blown even more. I was like, wow, this is real. This is serious. This is actually how it happens and how it goes down. And I remember one of the first things that really stood out to me was the George Floyd murder. When he was murdered, it was Rosanne Williams. She was the SVP. She ran operations for U.S. for Starbucks, and she got on a workplace live call, broadcast the entire organization, and she was going through her typical routine, talking about results and what we need to work on, et cetera. And then she paused and said, I can't continue on with this session without acknowledging what has taken place in society. I know there's people hurt. I know there's people broken. I'm hurt by what I'm hearing, what I saw, and got teary-eyed and shed some tears on this call. And I remember sitting there thinking, I wonder how many leaders in America, period, will even mention this incident at work, let alone on such a public forum, and be willing to display that level of vulnerability and concern, especially at a company that large. Like, my mind was just blown at the willingness to be that courageous and vulnerable. And I was like, that would have never happened at any other places that I would have worked. It wouldn't have even been mentioned, let alone creating space for it. And then I started to see other leaders, other VPs creating space to have these dialogues. I had a leader who scrapped our entire weekly meeting the week after it happened and said, nothing else matters but how people are feeling about what's going on. So we don't have agenda outside of how are you feeling, and let's check in. And I remember getting off some of these calls and talking to my wife. She's like, how was it? Because I was new to Starbucks, and I was like, that felt more like group therapy than work. Like, I feel
Yeah.
good. I feel human. I feel like seen. I feel understood and heard and valued. And it makes you want to do work more effectively. And I would say that was the time frame in my career where I really understood the core concepts of DEI. I lived it up until that point, but that was the moment where I really conceptualized it and understood it from the standpoint of how it truly can impact in a positive way workplace culture.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it sounds contradictory. We talk about culture, and usually what we go to is, what are the shared norms? What are the shared values? What are the expected behaviors, right? And that's what unites us. But the reality is we're all unique, right? As individuals, nobody's ever been like you before. Never will there be another like Andrew, right? Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's a bad thing. I don't know. But right. But even if you have a physical twin, right? Even twin, there's still uniqueness there. And so, okay, we need to be united in around, shared mission, shared values, but we also need to allow ourselves to be unique and individuals. And so I think rather than looking at as polar opposites, really it's the integration of those two, right? Yes, these are the things that unite us. These are but each of us might be responding to this situation or this incident differently. How do we create space to allow for that? And then allow each person to show up as their authentic self. And those aren't contradictory. I see them as complementary, So you found out that, hey, by that leader showing her values and asking how you guys were feeling, it allowed for a space of saying, I need to meet you where you're at in your own unique journey. All right. And that gives you permission to be you, not just some corporate clone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we talk about growth and we talk about developing, I think it starts with self-awareness. And part of that self-awareness are what are your values? What are those guardrails personally that help you make decisions if there's a fork in the road? What are those strengths and skill sets you have? What are your weaknesses? What are the areas where you know you're not that good at? I believe that's where all leaders need to spend some time, because once you understand that, then it becomes easier to figure out, all right, how does this align with my organization? How does this fit in with my organization? How does this elevate my organization because I have this set of core values? And then also being intentional with articulating the why behind it. That's where I think connection and trust can be built and established, because you have a better understanding. And I'll share an example. I was leading a session and we are doing a core value activity where we're kind of expressing our top 3 to 5 core values. And this one guy said, you know what? One of my core values is stability. So we asked, why is that a core value of yours? Where did that start? And he said, well, I grew up in a military household, military family. I moved about 12 times before the age of 18. And
that was my experience. Yep.
It was very hard to make friends, and just he did not like that, right? There's a lot of challenges. So for him now, he does not like change. He is going to stay in that house for a very long time. He said, I'll probably die in that house. Like, I don't like change. So think about that. That's one of his biggest factors, biggest values that help him make decisions. Now, if you're his leader and there's some change coming down the pipeline and you don't know that stability is very important to him, you're going to miss the opportunity to handle that situation well, because you don't understand, okay, I need to have a meeting before the meeting with this individual and be very clear on what's happening, what we know, what we don't know, how do you feel about it? And that's where values can become really important, especially when we think about how they make somebody feel and how engaged they may be within the workplace as a result of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And in that situation, if your value is novelty and variety and adventure, and you're a leader and you see this change and you're all excited about it because it's new and it's novel, and then in your messaging, you're all about like, this is totally new. We're changing everything. And that's energizing you. Well, that's sucking the wind out of that poor dude. Right. And it's not that he's against change, right? But he's just like, hey, I got to know that I've got a base of stability in all of this. Right. And so, because even that house he's living in, I bet you, I guarantee you he's done some remodeling. I guarantee you he's changed some paint. So it's not like stability is against change, but like in that situation, to your point, to be able to say, hey, Andrew, listen, we got some things coming up, but even with the biggest changes that we've all experienced, 90% of what we're doing is still the same. The biggest change of is never going to affect more than 10% of what's going on, right? So it's like, look, this is new, but it's 10% of this, right? The core things, the core services, the same customers, same product, how we're going to do it a little different in this aspect, right? But really we're starting from a foundation. So just changing that message to align with that person's values, I think it's less about motivating people, trying to put in the energy versus just aligning with what their values are to extract or unleash the energy that's already there. I think that's a great example of being mindful of that distinction. But if you don't know it, you can't make that customization, right? If you treat everybody the same, that's the biggest unfairness thing you can do.
You missed the mark. That's right.
Well, so what are some tips you can share with our listeners? And maybe this is in one of your books, so give us a little slice of that. Okay, I've inherited this dysfunctional culture. There's been the beatings will continue until morale improves, right? Kind of a thing. and it's embedded, and it took time to get it to that place. It's going to take time to undo it. What are some practical steps that a leader can do to begin to discover those values and start using them to rehabilitate really that damaged culture?
Yeah, I think it's, in the book, The Circle of Leadership, the first one I wrote, I break it up in 3 Ps: purpose, people, process. And in that order is what I encourage leaders to follow through on. And oftentimes when we're trying to do cultural change, we start with process. What do we need to tweak? What benefits do we need to add? What do we need to change? When in reality, you got to start with why. It's kind of the whole Simon Sinek premise, right? And that why is, why was this company formed in the first place? Why do we exist? What are we trying to accomplish? What's the vision, mission, values? What does success look like in 10 years? You have to start there and then figure out, okay, where are we at now? Because oftentimes organizations will have aspirational values, which can be fine, but they communicate it through the lens of these are our values today. And that's where
yes.
Exactly. And it diminishes and ruins trust. Because this new hire is saying, wait a minute, innovation is on the wall. It's in our handbook, but we are not open to any new ideas here. So are we trying to be innovative, or are we saying we are, There's got to be consistency there. So I think you almost have to do an audit to start with to figure out who are we, where are we trying to go, and then where are we at today? And you can get that information through having town hall discussions, through surveys, climate surveys, employee engagement surveys, et cetera, to really just get a pulse on where we're at. That's going to give you the data you need to then figure out, all right, how do we get the right people on the bus in the right seats? And how do we get the wrong people off the bus? Part of that may be realizing that, hey, we have the wrong people in certain key roles that no longer help us elevate the culture we're trying to engage in. And if you don't know where you're trying to go, it's going to be hard to then determine who do we need on the bus to help us get there. So that's where you get into the people part. So I would say just to start off with, you really have to be honest with where you're at as an organization and the individuals on in your organization and where you're trying to get to and where is the gap. And that will help you start going in the right direction to figure out how to challenge that.
And it can be scary to acknowledge that, hey guys, our current reality is not where we want it to be. Right? It's like that is admitting that there was some kind of mistake, there was a missed opportunity, whatever. And yet what change could ever happen unless there wasn't some opportunity to do something differently or better? Right? So is it really a mistake, or is it that's just the reality where we are? I mean, you talked about that East Coast division, and, part of their challenge was they were growing really rapidly, which I've certainly lived this, right? You grow too fast. You just can't pay attention to the details that you normally would. And then things get away from you, right? And the next thing you know, wait a second, how did we let that in? And how did that become the norm? That's not who we are. So to be able to just say, hey guys, that's not who we are. That's not what we want to be. I think that honest acknowledgement, but again, it goes back to the courage to be vulnerable. I'm hearing a definite theme in all of your stories, Andrew. That's got courage and vulnerability, right? Those are two core things that are more similar than they are different. And then you start to talk about address the wrong people in certain key roles. And I think a challenge I know I've seen, Andrew, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is, they're like, well, but Sam is so technically qualified for that role. He's a great sales guy, or she's great at operations, or he's wonderful in accounting, or whatever the thing is, right? And I think you talk about assessing, I'm picking up on, there's a difference between assessing technical alignment versus assessing behavioral alignment, right? I mean, Andrew could be the most technically sophisticated dude in that role ever, but if his behavior is modeling or showcasing values that are perpendicular to our purpose, we've got to address the fact that, I'm sorry, he's not the right guy in that job. So how do you help people who've grown up only looking at technical proficiency be able to acknowledge and sense when there's a behavioral deficiency? I guess that's a bigger question for a larger podcast, but I'd love to get your thoughts on it.
This is where storytelling can be powerful, in my opinion. And I had the pleasure of experiencing this early in my career, which cemented the idea that the opportunity cost of somebody who is a good technical performer, but is a cancer culturally, is too big to ignore. And ultimately, it will be more advantageous for someone to let somebody go who's being a cancer to the organization, even if they're an individual, really strong contributor. There's a store manager that I led who had been with the company longer than I'd been alive. She's one of the first store managers I inherited. The person who hired her was the current CEO of the organization at that time. So she was also one of the nicest people you'll ever meet. But just for context, I mean, just to this day, probably one of the sweetest, nicest people I've ever met. Terrible performer. Store consistently performed poorly. The entire community knew her by first name. They loved her. She was nice and sweet, would go above and beyond. But when you talk about having a productive store, a clean store, staff that's well trained, good inventory numbers. I mean, you look at almost any metric, they were towards the bottom. And a lot of district managers knew that, but they were fearful of holding her accountable because of how nice she was and because of the fact the CEO had hired her. So they just gave her a lot of grace. But I got to the point when I inherited the store where I realized my mentor would always tell me like, hey, you have to be mindful that if there's a clear problem and you don't address it as a leader, the other person's going to be held responsible and accountable for it. So are you willing to let certain things slide, knowing that they're not going to come to her and fire her. It's going to be coming to you and you being held accountable. So what I did in that situation was, I let her know all the great things that she's doing and the things that if we had other managers replicate, we'd be in a much better spot. But also was clear that we're missing the mark on some of these different categories, and provided the data to her to let her know. And then it turned to collaboration. What do you think we need to do to get things better? Oh, you need some more people? Okay, this is what I'll do. I'll set up hiring events for the next 4 weeks. We'll do X, Y, and Z. Okay, you need an extra manager to come help train this new hire. Perfect. I'll work with them. And we got to the point where everything she requested, I did that was within my control. So then it got to, okay, is there anything else you need to be able to hit these numbers? No, you've helped me quite a bit. Okay, perfect. That clarity kind of gave the green light to say, all right, you got 60 days. We've set these targets. They're more than reasonable. I've done everything that you asked me to do to help you do that. Now it's up to you to really get it done. And it became very clear as we got closer to that date, she was not going to accomplish those goals. So, I was kind of getting anxiety leading up to it, but I kept reminding myself, Angie, you did everything in your power. And, if it doesn't work out, you're just a messenger at this point. In fact, she should already know what's coming.
The choice was made on her side. Yeah.
Yeah. And fast forward, and she did hit the numbers, and we ended up letting her go. And I remember my first day going back to that store after she was terminated. I just expected the customers and the staff to just let me have it, just expected me to be the bad guy. As soon as I walked in, the top shift manager at the time comes up and says, we're gonna miss her, but thank you so much for doing that. Like we could not grow under her. She did not train and develop us well. And, she wouldn't really implement any of the ideas we had, and super sweet person, but we really appreciate that. We're going to be able to really hit the ground running. And that store performed better without a store manager than it did in the 20 whatever years that she was at the helm. And that was the moment that lesson got cemented in my mind and it's a little different because she wasn't necessarily a great individual contributor, but it was more so the lesson on the way people can rise to the occasion and perform when you get rid of somebody who doesn't need to be on the team anymore.
Well, and what I really like about that example, and I can very much relate to exactly what you're saying here. I think often when we say there's a behavioral challenge, we always think of it in the negative terms, right? They're a jerk, they're demeaning, they're inhuman, they're whatever, right? And honestly, I find those easier to deal with and be like, I don't have patience for that very much. So, but, the hardest folks that I've had to let go are the folks that were the nicest people on the planet. Like, I would welcome them to my home. I would enjoy a meal with them. They're universally appreciated. But the behavior in this case is, maybe it's being decisive. Maybe it is, challenging thinking. And that doesn't mean they had to become a jerk, but it just means they had to be kind and firm, and they weren't doing the firm part. So I think it's equally important to look at things that seem like they are positive attributes, but are still missing the other aspects of an effective leader as somebody who has negative attributes, and that can be just as damaging. So I appreciate, and the sequence, I liked how you laid out: set clear expectations. I was going to recap this, right? Set clear expectations. Maybe the expectations haven't been clear in 20 years, right? Unlikely, but possible. Collaborate on the solutions. Then you own the ones that you could do. So you're modeling, I'm being accountable. And you're like, is there anything else I could do for you? And they're like, no. And you're like, well, now I removed all the variables. There's only one, and it's your choice. And, they didn't make the choice. So you're like, okay, well, you're choosing to opt out. And, that might be because they're playing beyond their potential. Maybe it's because it's just they need something different. And you're not doing them any favors by keeping them around, having them know that they're one of the underperformers, having everybody else look at them and know, with questionable eyes. You're not doing that nice person any favors by keeping them in that role. So you've unleashed her, and you've unleashed the team.
There we go. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's a powerful story. Well, thank you for that example. Let's switch gears a little bit. We're talking about individuals and how people are unique and aligning and tapping into their values. Tell us a little more about, on a team scale, what are some things that leaders could do to create that psychological safety in a peer-to-peer environment or on a group environment versus just one-on-one? What are some psychological safety levers that we could play?
Yeah, so you hit on that earlier, right? It's vulnerability and really showing courage. I think when leaders can get in front of their team and let them know they don't have all the answers, I don't have it all together, I'm flawed, I don't make the best decision every single time, that gives permission for the rest of the team members to be human, right? And it creates an environment where we prioritize learning as opposed to prioritize defending our mistakes. I like to say fail fast, fail forward. If you're creating an environment where people are pushing, not in a sloppy way, but just in a way of, hey, how do we continue to get better? How do we continue to get more efficient? How do we continue to raise quality? I think when you have that type of mentality and cultural mindset, it helps people to be more willing to fail, more willing to push the boundaries and to make mistakes. And then if you're sharing those stories broadly, now we're putting people in a position to really be appreciated and recognized for the transparency they show and sharing some of their shortcomings. So one of the things I used to do as a leader was fail forward Fridays, 30-minute call every Friday. And we would talk about how we failed that week. And I would go first, right? And what it did was created an environment where we're sharing best practices. Hey, just FYI, everyone, I deleted this whole folder from this database. This is what I did. Dumb mistake on my part. This is what I learned, though. When you go in there, make sure, boom, boom, boom. Hey, thanks for sharing that. I could have done that. I almost did that last week, right? I appreciate you mentioning that. Or it's a situation where, hey, I meant to hit this email, schedule send this email, ended up pressing the wrong button and it got stuck in draft and I missed the deadline. This is what I realized. You got to boom, boom, boom. And the learnings we got from that were massive. So even just creating dedicated space to share mishaps can be very powerful. Another thing I would mention is you can do this a couple of different ways. There's some folks who are just not willing to be forthcoming with opposing views sometimes. So a couple of things you can do is maybe start stopping the meeting 10 minutes before you're done. And now you get everyone to say, all right, what have we not talked about that could derail what we just aligned on? What have we not discussed that could negate all the work that we hope to accomplish with the plan we just laid out? How can we poke holes in our boat, so to speak? And now you're inviting everyone to switch gears, put their critical hat on, and welcome, different viewpoints. When we think about psychological safety, we're talking about people being able to share their thoughts, their ideas without fear of ridicule, without fear of humiliation. So when you allow people to share thoughts that go against the grain in a safe environment, that helps to elevate the level of psychological safety. I've also seen examples where people will select someone to play devil's advocate for a meeting. So maybe you say, hey, Andrew, we're going to be having a meeting on a marketing plan. I know you have some really good experience in this area from your prior experience. Would love to get your thoughts on it to contribute, but I also specifically want you to have the lens on why would this not work? I know our team has, we don't embrace productive conflict as often as I would like. So I want to be strategic with who I put in position to make sure we're on the right track. Those are some very practical things that almost give people a license to be human, a license to push back, not just to be argumentative, but to ensure that we're truly sharing diverse viewpoints to get the best outcome.
Well, and I think that's the thing is you're accessing diverse viewpoints. Right. And so that's not to be resistant. It is to add to, it's to contribute, right? Two different ideas being added to the conversation. It's not like a game of ping pong where one gets knocked off and the other one survives. It's like, well, no, they're both on there. So now how do we solve this from a higher order perspective? It makes me think of Patrick Lencioni's, healthy conflict, right? And being able to mine for conflict. I know a tactic. I definitely use that notion of inviting it is like, we're talking about something. I say, okay, what's a different perspective? Who has a challenge with this? What is something we're not thinking about? Right. And inviting that. And because we try to get a great culture, we want great team cohesion. Everybody's all excited. There's momentum and people are like, well, I don't want to speak up and be the fly in the soup now. Right. But allowing time, like you said, naming the devil's advocate or naming there's the whole 6 hats exercise, right? Where the green hat's creative, gold is the Goldilocks, the black hat is the negative Nelly, where you're just like, well, look, what could go wrong? What are we not accounting for? What are the risks here? And allowing for each of those to be a contribution versus just a tit for tat exchange. Absolutely all of that is creating the divergence before we converge, I think sometimes as leaders, we try to converge so fast, we don't allow room for those divergent opinions. But it's like, let's get some clay on this pottery wheel before we start pulling it back. You know what I'm saying? Otherwise, we're just down to a nub. All great levers. Now, what's a sign though? Have you been in a situation where you're like, okay, I do feel like somebody is holding back. Like I've made the invitation, I'm signaling it, I'm modeling it, and yet this person they're defensive when you get called on. They won't speak up, contrarian because they don't want to rock the boat. Like, how do you pick up on that, and how do you help coach them back into that opportunity?
Yeah, one of the first things I try to look for is body language and just overall disengagement, especially if it's somebody who's typically active. If we're talking about a virtual call, they're typically active on the chat. Maybe typically have their video on. Maybe they typically come off mute and speak. If that seems to dip or drop during a certain topic, or they just don't seem to have an opinion when they typically may be opinionated, those are kind of red flags that I look out for to say, okay, this person's leaned away from the computer, so to speak. Maybe truly have done that, or they're kind of leaning away from the conversation. Great time to maybe invite them in. Of course, if it's in person or virtual, that can play a role. You can always send a direct message if it's virtual to ask them so they're not feeling called out in front of the group. There's some nuanced ways you can go about it, but I would say just disengagement and body language can be some of the first ways to look at that. Another thing that I like to look at when it comes to assessing how psychologically safe people feel is when someone's asked a question in their wheelhouse, and you feel like they're just making up an answer. Right? You feel like they're just rambling just to have an answer, as opposed to saying, "I don't know, I don't know the answer to that question, but I'll go back and figure it out. Let me get back to you sometime tomorrow." That's a sign of, hey, I'm okay with the rest of this group knowing I don't have all the answers. Even if this is a marketing question, I'm the head of market, I don't know that answer. And when people are saying I don't know in those meetings, that to me signals, okay, they feel a level of safety here to where they can be real, they can be human, and they can be honest.
It's interesting because that whole phrase, I don't know, I think some people, make that a cultural no. And I believe there's merit where that idea is coming from. And I think the distinction here, Andrew, and you feel free to disagree with me on this, but I think if you say, I don't know, as if that's the end of the conversation, that's not acceptable. Right. If you're like, what are we doing? Lee, what are your podcast numbers? I'm like, I don't know. Not my job, right? Like that, no, that's not okay. But to say, Andrew, I don't know right now. I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, but I'm going to go get them. Or, you know what, I'm going to figure that out, or I'm going to get some help, or I'm going to come back with a recommendation. I think the I don't know as a start of a conversation is totally acceptable and desirable versus it just being, well, that means I'm off the hook. What are your thoughts on that distinction?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the key is basically saying I'm going to take action afterwards. There's going to be action taken to be able to address that, because maybe I should know that answer, or maybe I'm best positioned to get that answer. That's where I think it's the differentiator. But at least saying I don't know is important, because especially if it starts at the top with the CEO, because if the CEO is around people who all report to him and he leads everyone, and the people are asking a question and he doesn't know the answer, she doesn't know the answer, like that's powerful for them to be like, I don't have that information. I don't have that answer. I'm not sure, but I'll take a note of that. I'll jot that down and I'll circle back around with you, or I'll have somebody on my team circle back around with you. It just shows that you're authentic. It shows that, you're not perfect. So I think that's super important.
And it takes on elaborate levels of a ruse. I've seen it with clients and organizations we've worked with where, and especially the more, technically proficient that organization might be, engineering, medical, law enforcement, right? I mean, these are very technically proficient people, and they're really smart and they're really good at what they do. But if they start to be like, well, look, I got to be the smartest person in the room, I got to have my stuff together. And it can take on elaborate levels of like, I got to know everything, because if I get asked the question, I have to answer it on the spot, or that's my head, or that's my job. It's just kind of like, man, that's exhausting. Is that the best use of our resources, right? To be prepared, like, versus just like be prepared for most of them. Yeah, don't show up and be lazy. I'm not endorsing that at all. But if you're asked a question that you legitimately like, you haven't really thought about, be like, you know what? That's a really good perspective. I haven't thought of that before. Let me go look into that and get back to you. what was wrong with that, right? So I think that shifting the norm, that to be the leader doesn't mean you have to be the most knowing or the most technically proficient. Being the leader means you're the most courageous, you're the most authentic, and you're the most willing to get after it and get to knowing it, right? That learning versus knowing, there's a very big difference between those two.
That's good. I agree.
I love it. I love it. Well, tell us again the two books that you have out there, Andrew, for folks who want more, and tell us a little bit about each of them so we know if there's one that's a better fit for us to start with. Which should we start with?
Yeah. So the first book I wrote is called The Circle of Leadership. It's a book on how to create and leverage culture in the workplace. That's where it talks about how to amplify your purpose, how to prioritize your people, and how to simplify processes within your workplace. So really good book to really dive into leadership and culture, in my opinion. And then the second book I wrote is called The Building Blocks of Belonging. That book is all about how to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion within the workplace. So it takes a data-driven approach on how you can elevate your culture and ensure that people feel like they belong. So I think it's really good collection of stories, statistics, and practical strategies. So both are available on Amazon, as well as my personal website, andrewadeniyi.com. So that's probably the best way you can get either of the two books. They're both short reads as well. So I'm not a big,
Appreciate that.
I'm not a big thick book person. So I like to keep them simple. So they're both around 200 or so pages. So very quick read, and I think they'll be enjoyable.
Well, it's like your style. You just get into it and get after it. So I love that. Well, definitely check those out. And where can folks reach out to you to follow your thought leadership, or maybe book you for a speaking gig? What's the best way for them to touch base with you?
Yeah, so you can go to my firm site, AAASolutions.us, and you could just submit an inquiry on the contact page, and that can will go straight to me. We can get on the calendar and chat. You can also follow me on LinkedIn. Very active on LinkedIn. Post a lot of articles and posts and just words of wisdom in the workplace culture and kind of leadership space. So those are two different avenues to be able to connect with me.
Fantastic. We'll definitely encourage folks to add you to their network. It's been a privilege to get to know you a little bit better here.
I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for joining us today on the Unleashing Leaders podcast. Subscribe so you don't miss a moment that could be the key to your next breakthrough. Let's stay connected and contribute together by grabbing that @Unleashing Leaders handle on LinkedIn, YouTube, or your favorite network. This is Lee Scott. Keep learning, loving, and leading. Our future and our communities are counting on us.